Hello and welcome back. We are going to be talking today about some of the problems that were occurring in American society in the 1920s. And we're going to start off by talking about the Red Scare. And the Red Scare really kind of begins in the 1919, but it continues throughout the 1920s. And what the Red Scare was that a lot of people were afraid that communism would spread from Europe to the U.S. If you'll remember, during World War I, Russia had the Russian Revolution, and the monarchy was overthrown, and what happens is that communists are going to take the place. And so Russia will become the Soviet Union, and it will become a communist government. Well, in Europe, communism starts to spread. And in the United States, people see communism as the opposite of democracy. And so as communism keeps going to more and more places in Europe, people in the United States are worried. They're afraid that communism is going to spread to the United States and take over. And there are communists who are living in the United States. There were anarchists, or people who really don't believe in a lot of government rules and control. And this fear of communism spreading started to have people act in ways they probably normally wouldn't. And that fear leads to what's called the Red Scare, people afraid of communism spreading or taking over the United States. And this is going to lead to people trying to find communists. A lot of people are going to lose some of their rights under the Constitution. And it's going to lead, push a lot of anti-immigrant feelings. And people are going to kind of be on this lookout for communists, and they won't always look for evidence or proof that someone is doing something wrong or that they're trying to make America communist. They're just afraid. And so people are going to get thrown in jail. They're not going to get jobs. So that Red Scare really fuels this fear. Well, people in the U.S. also, there was always kind of fear of immigrants coming into the U.S. We talked about that with the Irish. When we saw a lot of Irish coming into the U.S., people in the United States kind of had a backlash against Irish immigrants or Chinese immigrants, Japanese immigrants. In the 19s and the 1920s, a lot of people from Europe, especially Eastern Europe, began to pour into the United States to escape some of the really bad conditions that are over in Europe. And so in the United States, some people don't want a lot of immigrants from places like Italy and Greece. And so we see a lot of anti-immigrant feelings towards people from those places, also from Bohemia. And so what happens is we see this really big backlash against immigration in the United States in the 1920s. And it leads to something also called Americanization. And Americanization is the idea that people should be quote-unquote American, or this is what, if you're an American, this is what it looks like. So what does that mean? Well, what it meant for immigrants was that they were supposed to basically give up their culture or what they grew up knowing in order to be an American. And so immigrants who were coming in faced a lot of problems. They faced people not wanting to give them jobs. They were told they couldn't speak their language. They couldn't follow their traditions or the things that they were always used to doing. And so we see this anti-immigrant feelings really, and this Red Scare kind of come to this breaking point with two men, Sacco and Vanzetti. And I'm going to show you a little bit of video so you can see what happens with them when they get put on trial.
In the early 1920s, many Americans were terrified that communists would attempt to take over the country. Who were the communists? Why was there such a widespread fear of them? In 1917, Russia was taken over by a communist group known as the Bolsheviks. Communism is an economic system in which there is no private ownership of businesses or property. Because the average American takes great pride in the personal ownership of homes and businesses, communism was viewed as a threat to the American way of life. From the moment this revolution occurred in Russia, there were widespread fears that a similar type of communist uprising would occur in the United States. Some Americans felt that the recent influx of immigrants from Eastern Europe, where communist and anarchist philosophies were prevalent, only increased the likelihood of such an event. In 1919, it appeared that many of these fears would be proven correct. A plot was uncovered in which 36 bombs were mailed out to important political figures, as well as prominent businessmen. U.S. Attorney General Alexander Palmer and Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. were both targeted. John D. Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan were also threatened. On June 2, 1919, 8 more bombs exploded simultaneously in different cities across the country. Following these two incidents, the U.S. Justice Department launched a series of raids that came to be known as the Palmer Raids. This was an attempt to arrest and deport communists and anarchists who were seen as potentially dangerous. More than 500 foreign-born citizens were eventually deported. This panic over a communist threat became known as a Red Scare. The term is derived from a popular nickname, Reds, which was used to identify communists. Several other perceived threats also emerged in the 1920s. In April of 1920, 2 men were murdered during an armed robbery at a shoe factory in Braintree, Massachusetts. 2 anarchists were blamed for the crime. Nicholas Satcho and Bartolomeo Vanzetti both believed in a form of anarchism that promoted violent warfare against oppressive governments. They were placed on trial for the crime of murder and were eventually found guilty and sentenced to death. There was much controversy and doubt as to whether these 2 men actually committed the crime, but the frightened public was searching for a scapegoat to blame. Their sentences of execution were carried out in August of 1927. On the heels of this incident, a rumor began circulating that a major uprising would occur on May 1, 1920, but this never materialized. However, on September 1, 1920, a bomb exploded on Wall Street. 38 people lost their lives and more than 140 were injured. Communists and anarchists were immediately seen as potential suspects. Many were brought in and questioned, but ultimately no arrests were made. There was almost certainly a strong communist and anarchist presence in the United States in the late 19-teens and 1920s. However, it is largely believed that most of the fear over communist uprisings was the result of mass hysteria and paranoia.
And so that's just a little bit of an overview of the Red Scare in the United States in the 19s and the 1920s. And Satcho and Vanzetti is one of the most famous cases because they were put on trial and they were killed, and there wasn't a lot of evidence. It was a lot of circumstantial evidence. So that's a little bit on that. In the 1920s, there was also a resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan. A lot of parades. There was a lot of more members in the Ku Klux Klan, and we see this in U.S. history. The Ku Klux Klan, from its beginning, you'll see lots of members, and then the numbers will go down, and then you'll see another surgence in their membership, and then a dropout, and so the Ku Klux Klan also was pushing those anti-immigrant ideas and those really negative feelings for people who weren't like them. So we're going to watch one more video which kind of does a cultural overview of the 1920s.
What is roaring? The Roaring Twenties. Eh? That's what most historians say anyway, right? But what the heck do they know? Well, they know quite a bit, actually. And it was a very exciting time, especially in the United States. Here's the story of how American culture and values changed during the 1920s.
Once upon a time, a horrible war known as World War I devastated the planet. Immediately after the war, a lot of people in the United States were passionate about various causes, some good, some not so much. While women had finally won the right to vote and aimed at communists. Things got better for everyone, however, when the economy flourished. A lot of people were making a lot of money. They spent this money on the newest and coolest technology. During the 1920s, electricity became a mainstream thing. In 1907, only 8% of households had electricity in the United States. By the end of the 1920s, 68.2% did. More Americans began to buy automobiles, aka cars, telephones, radios, vacuum cleaners, refrigerators, and washing machines. They watched more and more motion pictures, aka movies or films, in spectacularly designed movie theaters. By the end of the decade, 3/4 of Americans went to a movie theater every week, and now viewers could hear the people speaking in the motion pictures. In the 1920s, Hollywood became the film capital of the world. Americans began to have more leisure time. With more leisure time, American culture also flourished. Americans became even more innovative. A new genre of music called jazz entered the mainstream, and dance clubs featuring jazz popped up across the country. New dances like the Charleston, the Foxtrot, and Lindy Hop all became popular. Teach me how to foxtrot, teach me how to foxtrot. Giant skyscrapers climbed up. Architects designed magnificent structures. Many of them still stand today. The arts thrived. Some of the greatest writers of the 20th century, names like Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald, part of the, quote, lost generation, came of age during the 1920s. The 1920s were also the heyday of the Harlem Renaissance, a cultural explosion drawing black writers, artists, musicians, photographers, poets, and scholars to Harlem and New York. With more leisure time, fads like flagpole sitting became popular. People would compete to see how long they could sit on a flagpole, with some sitting up there for weeks to set new world records. Another fad, dance marathons, exploded as couples competed to dance for as long as they possibly could, competing for money. Vending machines, crossword puzzles, and Mickey Mouse all originated in the 1920s. Perhaps no other fad is so distinctively 1920s than the rise of flappers. Flappers were fashionable young women who rejected the more conservative culture, even introduced new slang words. For example, you might walk down a city street and hear, "Baby, you're the bee's knees." Bee's knees meaning an extraordinary person. During the 1920s, for the first time ever, more Americans lived in cities than on farms. Well, why have I brought all this up? Almost everything I have mentioned so far is related to why American culture and values began to change during the 1920s.
And that was just a short overview of what we've been talking about with the 1920s. A really fascinating decade, and a decade of huge change. Up until probably recent modern history in the U.S., we've not seen that kind of change happen. Economics-wise, in the 1920s, extremely important, mostly because it's going to begin to lead us into the Great Depression. A lot of what happens in the 20s leads into the problems in the 30s, the 1930s. The stock market did really well at the beginning of the 1920s. Like everyone was making a lot of money. There's a couple of things for this. First was easy credit. What that meant, it was really easy to borrow money. So people were borrowing money like crazy and buying all these stocks. They also did something called buying on the margin. And what this meant basically is you were like, hey, I'm going to buy that stock from you for $10. I don't have $10 right now, but when I sell it, I'll pay you back the $10 and a little bit extra. So people were buying these stocks without any real money. And what happened was that the stocks were at these really high prices that really didn't mean anything. And so we'll talk about that next unit, how that's going to lead into the stock market crashing and the end of that prosperity and the beginning of the Great Depression. Also for economics, farmers were using new equipment. There was a lot of advances being made with equipment. You can see some of the changes that were happening. They were also beginning to plow more land because they could with all this new technology and farm equipment. What this meant for farmers is that in the 1920s, a lot of farmers are going into major debt, and if they can't sell crops, they're going to go under. Also, with plowing more land, that's going to cause issues because the areas where they're plowing those lands are not made to be farmed, at least not the crops that they're using. Not to say that all of the United States was having real prosperous farm time. Some of the areas, like around Montana and some of the Dakotas, were seeing drought sessions already through the 1920s. But all of these are going to, once again, kind of play a really important factor when we're talking about the Great Depression. That's the end of our unit and the end of the 1920s.